Topic B, Experiment 1. Evaluating a simple alloy microstructure. Objectives for these experiments are: first, perform tile-lead alloy dice casting. Second, prepare an opaque sample of metallographic examination. The third is operate invert metallurgical microscope. And finally, for objectives, interpret a simple multifaceted microstructure. By observing and analyzing, students will learn the relation between a multiphase structure and the appropriate equilibrium diagram, the correlation between a material macro structure with the sample prehistory. Appreciate that the properties of material depend on the type, amount, size, shape, distribution, and orientation of the phases present. In addition, the assignment involves the preparation of a binary alloy from its constituents and the interpretation of its microstructure. This experiment complements the topics of phase equilibrium. This lab is meant to provide you with some understanding of the practical significance of microstructural details. This assignment provides a preview of the structure properties themes covered subsequently. Background. Lead-tin alloy is a binary phase eutectic system that gives one of the simplest binary phase diagrams as shown in Figure 1. The phase diagram describes the state of the phases at temperatures and compositions. Let's see in detail. There are three single phases regions: alpha, beta, and liquid, and three two-phase regions: alpha plus L, beta plus L, and alpha plus beta. The alpha phase is a solid solution rich in lead tin as solute component, and the beta phase is rich in tin with lead as the solute. Upon cooling, the liquid phase is transformed into solid alpha and beta phases to form a characteristic microstructure that is dependent on the specific composition of the alloy and cooling rate. The subsequential microstructure that is observed under the microscopy tells the history of the microstructure development that goes through multiple stages of phases transformation during the cooling process. Alloy with the composition ranged from 18.3 to 97.8% of SN will form a pro-eutectic microstructure when the temperature is below 183 Celsius, which contains distinguishable a single phase region mixed with a mixture phases region. The single phase region is called pro-eutectic region as it forms during the state of alpha plus L or beta plus L before the eutectic temperature. The mixture phases region is called eutectic region as it forms when the temperature passes below the eutectic temperature. At that moment, the liquid phase turns into solid, forming a superstructure with alternative layers of alpha and beta phases. This process of the microstructure formation in this experiment is shown in Figure number 2. Taking an alloy with a composition around 40% of SN, for example, during the smelting, when the temperature is higher than 300 of Celsius, all is in one liquid phase as PV and SN are mixed homogeneously, took out the metal. Next, during casting, once the liquid alloy was poured into the mold, the temperature drops quickly, making the liquid turns into solids through the regions of alpha plus L and alpha plus beta on the phase diagram. During the region of alpha plus L, some alpha phase particles start to appear in the alloy liquid. As the temperature decreases, these particles grow in size while the volume of the liquid diminishes. Once the temperature drops across the eutectic temperature and enters the region of alpha plus beta, all the remaining liquid phase quickly turns into solid and becomes the eutectic region. As the diffusion rate becomes slow in solid, at this point, this kind of microstructure will maintain until the temperature drops down to the room temperature in this experiment. As a result, the final microstructure observed under the microscope will contain the regions of the single-phase alpha region as the pro-eutectic region and the regional mixture phases as the eutectic region. Of course, the final microstructure is dependent upon the composition of alloy. If the composition is close to the eutectic composition, 61.9% SN, there will be a little pro-eutectic region but only a eutectic region. If the composition ranges from 61.9 to 97.8, the pro-eutectic region will be beta phase rather than alpha phase. In this experiment, samples are polished and then etched in order to observe the microstructure of the alloy. As the alpha phase tends to be more reactive than B phase, making it reflects less amount of light under the microscope. The dark phase on the microscope of images is likely to be the alpha phase, and the bright phase is the beta phase. In addition, the quality of the polishing and etching also determine how representative the observed image to the actual microstructure of the alloy. Although may not as quantitative, the characteristics of the microstructure do vary depending upon the composition. The composition values C1, C2, C3, and C4 are labeled on the phase diagram. At composition C1, which is close to 18.3% SN, the microstructure has most of the region occupied by some pro-eutectic alpha phase grains, which are separated by some thin layers of beta phase regions. At composition C2, which is at the middle between 18.3% and 61.9%, the amount of pro-eutectic alpha phases decreases in comparison with C1, and the feature of the eutectic region can be observed as a mixture of alpha and beta phases. At composition C3, which is close to 61.9, the majority of the region is taken by the eutectic region, which also contains some small regions of pro-eutectic alpha phase, suggesting that C3 is slightly lower than 61.9%. At composition C4, which is in the middle between 61.9 and 97.8%, the pro-eutectic region now becomes beta phase, which shows brighter color than the surrounding eutectic regions. As the microstructure is dependent upon the alloy composition, the theory can be verified by comparing calculated composition values based on the proportion of phases in the image with the actual value. First, the proportion of phases can be analyzed using an image processing tool that can highlight the region of the phase by defining an intensity range, measure the percentage of area of the highlight region. As an example shown in figure 4, the region image was analyzed but defined a lower range of intensity, that is the dark region, to highlight the area that is representative to the alpha phase in order to find out the percentage of area of the alpha phase. After this brief description of the diagrams, now it's necessary to understand how to relate the percentage of areas with the diagrams that we have. But in order to calculate the percentage of area of alpha phase needs to be converted into a percentage weight of alpha by taking the densities into account. First, an assumption is made that the compositions of alpha and beta phases are consistent with those at the eutectic temperature at 183 Celsius, which gives the composition of alpha as 18.3% of SN and beta as 97.8% of SN. With information that we have mentioned, we can calculate the density of alpha or beta phase. This is our equation, the first equation for this experiment. Substituting instead the composition of alpha or beta phase. It's C alpha or C beta. On the other hand, we need the density of the Sn or Pb. The corresponding weight percentage can be calculated as the following equation. This is equation number 2.
Using figure 5, a position of CO is assumed and the alpha and beta lengths are set as a function of the location of CO. In this way, equation 3 can be determined. Well, after some rearrangement of the equation 3, alloy composition can be calculated with this equation. And remember that C alpha and C beta are constants to be substituted in the equation that we have here. Well, now, we have a couple of diagrams, figure 6 and 7. Are similar, both of them. Actually, it's the same graphic, but the difference is that we are using each of them for different calculation. The first one is when the pro-eutectic phase is alpha phase. This is the figure 6. And the 7 is when the pro-eutectic phase is beta phase. Well, with these graphics, alloy determine the percentage weight of the pro-eutectic phase that is needed. In that way, we will find out the equations 5 and 6. And remember, we use the lever rule to solve the equations. Experiment steps and procedures. Our samples for this experiment are batches, particularly 3. Weigh the 3 batches of 10 grams of raw material of thin lead for dies, casting 3 samples with composition of tint as 35%, 62%, and 80%. The step 2 is prepare smelting. Don't forget to wear thermoglove on both hands. It's really important. Perform a dry run of smelting and pouring using an empty tube and a tube filled with water. The step 3 is to add 1 batch on the raw material prepared in step 1 and the bottle of glass tube and put the tube into the smelter at a temperature of 600 Celsius for 2 minutes. Then stir the liquid metal using a glass rod 10 times clockwise and 10 times counterclockwise. The first step is attach a clamp tongue on the tube and pour the liquid metal into the mold and wait for a minute before molding the bullet head sample.
The step 5 is repeat step 3 and 4 to finish casting all the 3 samples prepared in step 1. The step 6, mount the 3 samples into 1 resin block and perform a 4 stages grinding and polishing using the automatic sample polisher. For step 7, etch the polished samples using 5% nitro for 5 to 10 seconds and rinse each chant using tap water and then blow dry specimen using compressing air. Don't worry, we almost finished this video. There are a lot of steps, but we need to take care about that. Step 8. Observe the microstructure of sample under microscope. Use the optics to find out the proper magnification for this study. Step 9. Identify the eutectic phase as alpha or beta. Use image processing tool to highlight the region of a phase and find out the percentage of area of the highlighted phase. Step 10. Calculate the density of alpha and beta phases using equation number 1. And finally, the last steps. The 11. Calculate the percentage of weight alpha phase using equation 3. And the step 12. calculate the percentage of Sn composition based on the imagine used in the equation 4 and calculate the weight percentage of the pro-eutectic region used in equation 5 or 6. And finally fill out the table that is presented here.